My name is Hannah Malein, and I am the Creative Director at Colourhive and Head of Trends for Mix magazine. So just to tell you a little bit more about Colourhive, if you have not heard of us before, this is going to be fun. So Colourhive, we're essentially a London-based creative agency. Our main focus is on colour and trend forecasting and analysis. So we work on quite a broad different projects from kind of product development, CMF design, through to kind of content and marketing strategy as well. So it's quite broad. We are also the proud creators of Mix magazine, which is a quarterly magazine with focus on all things colour and trend, that features our colour forecast as well. So what is colour forecasting? We get asked that rather a lot, even though it is what we do. It is kind of what it is. We're forecasting popular hues that will kind of be appealing to consumers for the season we forecast for. But it's important we don't always just look ahead, even though sometimes I totally forget what year it is right now. It's really important that we look to the past, we look to the present, and really sort of understand what's going on at the moment. So we forecast social trends and their impact on consumer preference and behaviours. Colour forecasting is important because so you apparently have about 90 seconds to make an assessment on colour. You'll have been doing this all morning and probably much quicker because you're a lot sort of more experienced on reacting to products. But did you know that between 62 and 90% of that assessment is based on colour alone? So it's rather a lot. So we all know this one, but 80% colour increases 80% of brand recognition, and we know that colour is so important in recognising a brand and sort of building a relationship with a customer, and it obviously improves customer confidence as well. So that's not just in the branding, that is perhaps in products as well. And all else being equal, colour is often the reason why products are chosen. It's really unlikely, again, if all else is equal, that you will choose to buy a product in a colour that you don't like. And it's believed to influence buying decisions by up to 85%. So it's quite incredible. And I'm sure you know it's important. Okay, so before I dive into the sort of trend, the stories with the palettes and the materials, I just want to sort of set the scene a little bit with our trend drivers. So these are kind of some influential factors that really sort of gave us inspiration when we were building these trends. These were part of the conversation when we were putting the stories and the visuals and also the palettes together. So I'm going to share these with you. So these are sort of everything from environmental, political, of cultural, social shifts that we keep an eye on, everything that's affecting consumer sort of behaviours and their sort of preferences going forward. So it's all reacting to those sorts of things, and then we visualise those in our trend stories. So let's kick off. So the first of which is water scarcity. Now this is quite a big one and a huge one for textile industry in particular. But water scarcity now affects every single continent on the globe, around the globe, and even though our water rate or water use is increasing kind of twofold, so this is really something on the minds of consumers going forward, and it will be, and companies are really sort of sharing their credentials in terms of responding to this. So this is an important one. The next is also an environmental issue, but quite a sort of modern day one in our kind of upgrade culture. So companies, again, are having to be really responsible about sort of post-consumer waste here. So we're seeing some really interesting reaction to this from designers, so kind of really interesting composite materials and everything from jewellery to office furniture as outcomes of this. And this is another thing that we'll be seeing a little bit more of in terms of design. Design for death. This may seem a little bit of an odd one, but I don't know if you've noticed there seems to have been a shift particularly in the last sort of couple of years of the way that death is spoken about, particularly I've noticed it in advertising, and it's something we've spoken a lot about. This is also in parallel with a slight decline in sort of practicing traditional religions and a rise in sort of spiritual kind of practice as well. So we're seeing really interesting sort of responses from a design perspective. So kind of memorial objects, things that sort of support the grieving process and things like that. So there's some really interesting projects coming through, and it's quite an interesting one. So keep an eye out, and I think you might notice. Exclusivity versus inclusivity. So this has had an impact from kind of the sort of basic market through to sort of the luxury market, and it's all about kind of appealing to a kind of a broad audience, but keeping a kind of level of sort of luxury or sort of interesting design. So it's sort of finding that balance between the two. This is a really interesting. Okay, it's gone. Never mind. So I think there's two people on the. So this is a cosmetics range by Maud, who that appeals to everyone. You can see it's got really, really beautiful packaging, but it's for sort of all ages, all genders, and it's really sort of an inclusive product range, but still kind of really beautifully marketed and packaged. Okay, under the dome. So we're seeing a huge shift, and this is again something you will be aware of, is this sort of merging of what sort of our home life and our work life, and this is kind of going to continue and become a bigger part of the way that we sort of spend our time, to the extreme of sort of these big brand campuses that really sort of try and kind of keep you under their dome, if you like, as long as they can, and sort of provide all sort of living and working and entertainment under one space. So we're seeing things sort of in these more enclosed spaces, visually and sort of theoretically. Mm-hmm. And the last of the drivers is rethinking ugly. I'm sure you'll all sort of know of the ugly trainer, and we're really seeing this coming through into different types of products. This is a really cool ceramic piece. So it's things that provoke a reaction. There's just so much going on at the moment. There's so much visuals that we see all the time. So this is about disruption. This is about kind of catching your attention, whether you like it or not. It's not really the point. It's just sort of catching your attention and sort of making you think and look twice. Okay. After all those drivers, what we like to do and make sure is that all our trends are really balanced. As you probably understand, in terms of trends, there's often a push and pull of what they're about. They're often opposite reactions to something, to the way that we're feeling or what's going on in the world at the moment. So what we've done, we've created what we call this matrix where all our trends sit, just so you can kind of see what they're all about. So one of the big sort of behaviours and sort of needs that we have at the moment is this sort of idea of protection. So we've called that side protective. And then kind of the opposite to that is being reactive. So it's not kind of hiding away from something, it's kind of reacting and shouting about it and kind of making it known. Then we talk about sort of inclusivity, sort of appealing to everyone, being kind of really considerate and kind of broad thinking in terms of its appeal. And then on the opposite side of that, being exclusive, so being like super luxury or super individual or super personalised, and kind of, so that being sort of the opposite side. So this creates a sort of space matrix, if you like, for our 4 trends of the season to sit. So first up, we have Guff, which sits in this sort of inclusive, protective area. It's about being responsible, but it's about protecting your environment, or the environment and your environment. The opposite side of this, so this is still inclusive. This is talking about sort of community and sort of other people. It's not just kind of personal, but it's a reactive trend. It's not a sort of protective, reclusive sort of trend. Thirdly, is Dome. So this is in this protective environment, but it's very exclusive. You'll see this is much more sort of luxe and quite sort of high level. And the last but not least, the most fun of the set is Gorge. So this is this reactive trend. There's no kind of hiding from this one. It is quite in your face. But it's still exclusive. It's still got this kind of air of luxury and exclusivity to it. So let's kick off with Scuff. So Scuff, this is about kind of necessity inspiring ingenuity. So it's being really kind of clever with materials and sort of repurposing and showing sort of interesting details. So with increasing scarcity of resources and income, creativity and resilience become ever more important. So that's sort of the main sort of driver of the trend. So in terms of aesthetic, hopefully you can all see the screen, but here we look at this kind of sort of curated, uncurated look. So it's sort of quite almost designed to look a little bit haphazard and sort of collected as if you've kind of got personal collections of things. Definitely imperfections are celebrated. We look at sort of sustainable materials massively and things that are functional. They're not over fussy. There's clean sort of shapes and their function is quite apparent from their form. And we look at this sort of accidental beauty both in sort of design elements but also in the colour palette, which I'm going to show you here. So what catches your attention first is that geranium, the bottle green, and maybe the buff sort of stands out there as well. So this is really designed to be this sort of almost accidental palette. You've got sort of these sort of random accents and flecks. The geranium and the bottle green definitely kind of maybe smaller kind of proportions of colour. But then you've got this beautiful group of quite yellow-based neutrals, actually. So the hop sack, buff, and the oatmeal, which looks even more yellow on there. And then the iron, grey, and ash are really sort of more defining, sort of slightly reddish greys, and then the cement there that's a really sort of beautiful neutral that supports the palette there. So this is just a sort of exercise in showing you how you can use the palette. You can see it's super versatile. You can do some quite sort of striking contrasts with the colours or some really sort of beautiful layered neutral groupings there as well. So in terms of materials to bring the trend to life, so we look at lots of different concepts. We've selected 4 to show you today of how this could be realised in materials. So we've got repurposed materials, repaired materials, stone and kind of coarse materials too. You can, I don't know whether I'm clicking or not. So this is looking at kind of sort of this raw and refined aesthetic. We look at these sort of composite materials that I'm trying to go on the next one without going too far. Composite materials that are put together. They have this beautiful serendipity of flecks of colour, this sort of beautiful randomness, mainly kind of for hard surfaces, but you can see some really beautiful sort of shapes and mottled colour in these. The next is repaired. So this is more about kind of making small details on materials. I'm going to click to the next one so you can see some more examples. So it's not just textiles. We see sort of quite obvious kind of stitch and binding and repair marks as something being really beautiful and obviously has sort of a sustainable ethos to it too. Stone, and this is kind of not about highly polished stone. It's sort of leaving elements that are a bit sort of rough and raw. And there's some really beautiful sort of simple shapes and structures here. So the one in the top right is actually kind of waste construction granite. So there's some really interesting shapes and finishes you can see here. And then sort of raw and coarse materials, so perhaps revealing that side that you'd usually cover up or turn around to the back. There's some more pictures coming. So you're revealing those sort of interesting sides. You can see the detail, and maybe there's some sort of burnished or rusted areas as well. So those are really celebrated, those kind of individual details that are celebrated. So just to kind of in context, so this is bringing the colour palettes in with some more sort of realised products. So in terms of design, we're looking at this sort of brutalist movement, a brutalist shape. So very, very sort of functional form, not kind of over fussy, quite sort of chunky, poured concrete, which works really, really beautifully with the colour palette, with those neutrals, the yellow-based and the sort of slightly warmer concrete tones. And the next one is Eroded by Design. So this is looking at revealing surface layers. So this is a really beautiful one. There's some more pictures where you're sort of revealing the layers of colour underneath, or in terms of lighting, sort of like almost as if it's sort of organically cracked open. So you're seeing and revealing different layers in the form. The next is structural textiles. This is a really nice one. It shows really kind of heavy-duty, quite hard-wearing materials, but it shows almost the graphic nature of the weave and the patterns on there. Again, in these neutral tones, you can see these that really sort of highlights those structures, and that it's about sort of tough and durable materials. And then the last for scuff is these sort of seeing how things fit together. So you're kind of seeing these sort of building blocks and marks and how things may fit together. They're sort of the mark of assembly, really. So whether that's kind of a woven or flat surface or whether that's a structural piece of furniture, it works really well for furniture too. Okay, so that concludes scuff. So back to the matrix, we're now going to shift across to the more sort of reactive side of things, and this is ritual. So ritual looks at the very idea of rituals, be it literally just kissing someone goodbye, having your coffee in the morning, to something much bigger. But it's really about finding kind of connection and meaning in rituals and therefore kind of products that surround us. It's about storytelling. So in times of uncertainty, the comfort of the ritual, both spiritual and everyday, reassures us in a world that often feels perilously out of control. And I think you'll agree it's something that really resonated with us when we were putting this trend together, and the objects are sort of designed to reflect that. So it is a personal trend, but it's also about kind of community and your sort of interactions with other people. It's meant to be meaningful and have a perhaps sort of more spiritual undertone to it. Looking at kind of elemental materials, quite sort of connected to sort of slightly crafted elemental materials, some sort of antique references too. This one's very curated. It's not like scuff. It's very sort of beautifully designed, and there's some sort of traditional design elements in there as well. Ooh. Might have double-clicked. So the colour palette, you probably straight away be drawn to the darker element of the palette, which really probably is the sort of main focus. So that really beautiful sort of velvety juniper, coal, that really dark pine green. But it's balanced, like all our trends. It's balanced with these sort of watery, more airy side of the elements. So we have white sage and blue calcite. Then you've got a hit of green tea, arsenic, and then a really clean alabaster white in the palette. So it's really interesting to use, and it can be used in all sorts of different proportions, which you can see here. So again, you can see this like quite dramatic kind of light and dark, or some softer sort of watery combinations as well. The colours look a little bit odd, but you can see them properly in the magazine. So the material concepts for ritual are disrupted glass, hairy materials, Gothic marbling, and ebonized wood. So disrupted glass, this is about really sort of interesting effects on glass. I'll show you some more pictures. And that you can see it's quite sort of fluid and multifaceted. It's not just about kind of clean sort of plain glass. It's all sort of either kind of oily finish or these sort of quite sort of almost fluid shapes that really refract the light. And they've got some quite sort of mysterious qualities to them as well. So I think that's quite an interesting direction and holds the colours really beautifully. Hairy materials. So this is kind of linked to more, I guess, the sort of the traditional kind of rituals or mementos or from the sort of spiritual side of the trend. But we don't just look at human hair. There's also kind of raffia and anything kind of that can be braided. So sort of sisal and raffia and horsehair actually is an interesting one as well. So it's quite sort of experimental, whether it's woven or sort of used as tassels. Marbling, we're not really seeing this going anywhere quite yet, but here it's really about these kind of really quite dramatic veins of marbling. So kind of the green and black, you can see. I'm trying to show some more pictures. So you can see, you can see almost these sort of liquid effects of the marbling here, quite dramatic use of colour, whether that's sort of dark or light, or some of the sort of the greens as well coming through. Ebonized wood, so not just kind of varnishing it, it's really having this sort of inherent depth of black within the wood that we're seeing this around a little bit, but it certainly works well with this trend, and it really, really highlights the natural patterning in the wood as well, which is important. So in context, we look to sort of more blackened surfaces. So here, looking at charred, almost brittle surfaces that have this really beautiful, like, slight sheen to them. So it's not matte or kind of satin even. It's all this like slight sheen that you get from these sort of charcoal effects that work really beautifully on surfaces and furniture. And then a little bit different, a bit lighter. This one's about watery effects. Watery elements, so really kind of soft movements through the kind of lighter colours in the palette, that blue calcite sort of highlighting and showing these really sort of beautiful ripply, airy effects. And then black and red, so this is again kind of a colour application, but sort of using the sort of darker colours and the red to really highlight and accentuate shape, whether that's furniture or texture in surfaces. And poisonous greens, this is also a comment on the way that you can use the palette. We've seen kind of huge return to green in the last few seasons, but here it's really about using quite sort of different types of greens together. So whether that's the arsenic or the green tea, and layering those up together, so they're quite sort of interesting. And then they're kind of not sort of the natural verdant kind of grassy greens. They're these kind of quite weird tones used together, which look quite interesting. Okay, so that concludes ritual. And the next is dome. So this one is, this one's in the sort of protective, exclusive area. It's running away with me a little bit. So this one's about kind of protection and deflection, and it's sort of hiding away, and it's quite sort of selfish in its outlook because you want to be sort of surrounded in this sort of luxury place, and it's about an escape. So Dome references a futuristic, utopian dream world, a place to escape from our many global challenges. So this has a bit of a sort of retro-futuristic vibe. It's a bit sort of utopian. It's a bit kind of dreaming of getting to Mars and sort of escaping our planet. But it has this air of luxury. It's very, very controlled. Everything's quite sort of polished and perfect and perfectly curated and placed. And this is reflected in this really sort of controlled tonal colour palette, which is on the next slide. So this really sort of relies on this kind of quite long tonal run through from camel through to kind of hide and tan, and then you've got this punch of cherry wood and brick red. So you can do some really beautiful analogous combinations, so really kind of close colour groupings together that really shift and move through. There's not kind of sharp corners or sharp colour changes in this trend at all. It's all about kind of blending colours together. Then accented, so you've got that pink granite, which is a bit of a sort of different turn, and the pebble is slightly green, and then a bit of definition from the dark brown umber as well. Okay, so this is some colour proportions. Again, you can see really the versatility of the trend. Often you won't be using 8 colours from the trend palette all in one go, so it's always really interesting to see how you can use it and how you can build a colour collection from that palette. So in terms of materials, so finishes we look to soft touch, then to high density comfort, you can imagine what that is, Hyperloop, and then engineered wood. So soft touch surfaces, this is really important. It's such a tactile trend that you just sort of want to immerse yourself into. So whether it's this slightly sort of rubberized or waxed finish or really soft buttery leather, is quite sort of central and kind of begs to be touched in terms of surfaces. High density comfort, so whether this is really deep pile, heavily tufted carpets, or kind of really overstuffed upholstery that you can really just sink down into. This is key to the trend. It's all about this sort of comfort in luxury. This one's Hyperloop. So this is looking at, again, this sort of slight excess of material, but kind of like lots and lots of loops, again, creating quite a sort of quite a kind of comforting effect to textiles, but it's quite sort of rich visually. So whether that's leather or wool, we're seeing this interesting surface effect across lots of different materials. And engineered wood. So this one's about really sort of perfect, beautifully carved and cut wood. It's not sort of rough and raw like we saw before. So whether it's sort of laser cut or sort of beautifully chiseled and beautifully round, you can see there's so much kind of round, soft shapes as part of dome. And then in context, so some of these colour groups with products, just to sort of show how it can be visualised. So this is ribbed mid-tone, so using these kind of tonal, quite sort of close colours together. So whether this is shadow or whether this is pattern, it can be used in pattern for sort of rugs and things, but this sort of ribbed effect, again, you probably want to run your fingers over it. This one's lovely for interiors, of course, so these nested families and nested groups of products or furniture. So beyond the nest table, we see sort of lots of groups of products. And again, this can influence pattern as well, so this more sort of undulating groups of shapes. And then shape and colour-wise, we look to the red planet, Mars, for inspiration. So again, lots of these sort of circles and rounded shapes, and this kind of warm earth red, so you've got the sort of tan and camel colours there. And the last for dome is urban futures. So it is looking quite sort of at architectural structures as well, which is really interesting for sort of for all sorts of surfaces, whether that's moulded surfaces or these textile prints as well. So they've got these quite, again, slightly sort of brutalist shapes, but again, we're really seeing the form from these sort of slightly sort of 60s, 70s motifs as well. Okay, so that concludes dome. Getting hot. And then last in our sort of reactive and exclusive area is gorge. So this is the most sort of fun, playful trend for the season. It's kind of reaction to fatalism, and it's kind of a bit of a last hurrah. So it's finding pleasure in provocation. So with an emphasis on creativity and theatricality, themes of inclusivity are pushed aside in favour of exclusivity, rarity, and personal pleasure. So, as you might imagine, this is quite sort of over the top visually, colour-wise, sensory-wise, and sort of makes you kind of look twice. It's quite a conceptual trend. It's very experimental, expressive. It's in the reactive side of things, but it's meant to sort of disrupt. It's meant to catch your attention and kind of be immersive. You've got these sort of dissonant colours together, and it is slightly about novelty and maybe bringing a bit of a smile to your face. So the colour palette is really sort of bright and saturated, and really sort of catches the eye. It's got a bit of a sort of 70s vibe to it still. We've got the sort of marigold and sangria brown there. You may notice, I don't know if you can read the colour names, but they're quite food inspired. We had a lot of fun with some sort of 70s recipe inspiration. So there's pineapple and avocado and macaron and some rice pudding at the beginning for a really sort of creamy yellow neutral. So it's a really playful palette, and you'll see from the combinations and proportions here, actually you can get some quite sophisticated combinations if you sort of reduce the amount of colours you're using, but then some really kind of playful sort of multi-tonal combinations. So in terms of materials, how am I doing for time? In terms of materials, so we look to these sort of squashed and extruded materials and shapes. Sort of velvet, we looked at over-the-top embellishment, and then we look to kind of jellied glass and sort of illuminated transparent materials. So squished and extruded, this is almost like it's sort of been pushed out of a mould in terms of form, or in terms of sort of piecing things together, whether it's sort of bulged out and everything's sort of squeezing out. So it is about excess and slightly over the top and slightly kind of odd forms and shapes that have a bit of a sort of serendipitous form. Oops. Velvet, so we're seeing this in all forms. Again, this is a really sort of tactile trend about sort of touching something and interacting with it. So we're seeing a sort of embossed velvets, tufted velvet, and flocking is a key one as well. Again, kind of creating really sort of interesting surface to an odd form, perhaps. So over the top embellishment, so really going kind of full on with the beading and the embroidery, just really sort of bringing surfaces to life. Also really interesting coating, so really sort of layered and quite tactile, building up sort of layers of different tones as well, like you can see in the bottom there. And then illuminated and jellied glass, so this is really interesting one and really sort of elevates the colours and makes them, rather than just seeing them solid, you can see them sort of in transparencies as well. So there's really interesting light effects, a little bit like in Ritual, but this is like multi-toned, using those together with different sort of light effects and different groups. So they almost look edible in some senses. And here's some ugly ceramics. So again, you've got this sort of slightly bulging, dripping kind of ceramics with interesting glazes on. So again, they're kind of like slightly odd forms, and they're sort of rounded and bulbous in shape. So as a sort of alternative to marbling, rather than marble, this is using sort of different pigments and paints. So we've called this one curdled, because almost from a sort of food inspiration. So looking at kind of how colours sort of melt and move together. Again, you can do it sort of tonally or some quite contrasting colours. So quite interesting effects. And then keeping it bright. Looking at multi-croic surfaces. So this is really beautiful on metals, but also really beautiful on glass. So you get this quite sort of multi-tonal, multi-croic effect. So it's really quite maximal in design. It's not sort of being quiet and reserved like in Scuff. It's really sort of turning up the volume with the colour and the shape. And the last one, I think, for Gorge is Sugar Swirl. So again, that sort of almost edible, sweet-like element, so sort of dripping glazes and the sort of tutti-frutti colour combinations as well. This works really beautifully across all sorts of different surfaces and glazes. And yeah, looks quite edible. Okay, so that concludes Gorge. So just to conclude the presentation from a kind of focused colour perspective, aside from working with the colours in the individual trends, it's really important for us to look at what's happening in terms of colour for the whole season, because that sort of gives us an indication of what's been going on and what will go on. So if I can show you the next slide. So this is our colour wheel. This is our all 32 colours from all 4 palettes together. And this indicates to us, we do lots more sort of looking at this in our publications, but this really indicates to us what colours are important and what areas are growing, and you can kind of almost sort of read from it visually where the key groups are. So I'm going to point out a few of these to you now. So the first up is growing green. I mentioned green within ritual and a couple of the other trends as well. You'll have noticed green was quite key to the palette, but we're seeing green growing rather a lot in terms of really different types of tones. So whether it's really blue based like the arsenic, or whether it's quite sort of much more yellow based like the green tea, as you can see here. So these sort of green layers are really, really, really key, whether it's tonal or whether they're slightly more kind of disrupted greens. That's a good place to look for 2021. So industrial greys, we're seeing these continue as key colours. Show you a bigger bit. So iron grey and coal, they've got a slightly purpley sort of undertone, and the cement a slightly sort of reddish undertone neutral. So these are really, really key in neutrals and sort of for material, sort of raw material colours too. Purple potion, you may have noticed, but purple's coming back in a big way. We're seeing it coming through in fashion and definitely sort of into interiors too. So these kind of velvety, soft kind of the juniper and the sangria, and that ash, even though it's quite shaded, has got this really beautiful purple undertone to it. Brown, again from fashion, but this is definitely making big moves into interior to replace sort of flatter greys and other neutrals that we've seen before. And again, these are quite easy to use when you sort of use them in these tonal groupings. So the camel and the hopsack from Scuff, and that burnt umber from Dome is a really rich brown. So we're seeing darker, richer browns in woods, but also for paint colours too. Golden rule. So this is the sort of picking up on the yellow. So I think the marigold and the pineapple and the tan. So again, beautiful layers, but also really some nice contrast with the sort of blues and greens and browns of the palette. And the last one is strange tones. So this one is sort of from across the colour trends. But we're seeing these kind of quite odd mid-tones, perhaps in the sort of fugly side of things, but these quite odd sort of mid-tone groupings that sort of contrast with each other, but they're all a very, very similar kind of level of colour. So look out for those. So just to conclude on the last point, I hope you've enjoyed the presentation today. There's so much to say. If you found it interesting, essentially what I've spoken about today is drawn from different elements of our Colourhive membership, which includes lots of different elements. So that some of it is taken from our Mix magazine, which is part of it. So as part of the membership, just to touch upon it briefly, you get access to the magazine. We also have all of our archive of Mix magazine on in digital format. A lot of the images in sort of the original elements of the trend we take ourselves, so they're kind of first generation inspiration images, and as part of membership you get access to use those on mood boards or projects or whatever you're working on, digital colour palettes to make it super easy if you want to have a play around in your design packages. We record ourselves talking about the trends as well, just so you can kind of have another perspective and another insight into the trends, so that we record those as part of trend briefings. And then the majority of what I spoke about today is a big part of our colour, material and finish forecast, which we publish twice a year with our sort of super in-depth coverage of colour, materials and finish, and lots of examples to inspire you. So if you're interested in finding out a little bit more or want to speak to me or ask me any questions, myself and my smiley colleague over here, Sam, would love to speak to you. As a special treat for coming and sitting in here with me today, we have 10% off membership. So if you can actually use it online and use the code DECOREX, easy to remember, or if you mention it in any communication with myself or any of the team, then do, and you can get 10% off. So thank you very much for coming again. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Sorry for the interruption earlier on in the presentation, but enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.